In 1944, the world's most powerful nations sat down and agreed to chain their economies to a metal. 30 years later, they couldn't get out fast enough. The gold standard sounds rational. Money backed by something real, something you could touch, a hedge against government lies. That's the story every economics textbook leads with, and it's not wrong exactly. But it's incomplete, because here's what nobody mentions. The gold standard didn't fail because it was bad at being gold. It failed because it worked too well at being a straitjacket. Let's rewind to the 1870s. Britain, the world's financial superpower, pegged the pound to gold at a fixed rate. The idea was elegant. If you held a pound note, you could walk into the Bank of England and demand gold in return. Trust crystallized. Other nations copied the model. France, Germany, eventually most of the industrialized world. For 50 years it worked. Trade flowed, prices stayed stable. Investors knew the rules and played by them. But here's the trap nobody talked about out loud. Once you're on the gold standard, your economy becomes a hostage to your gold supply. Need to grow, hire workers, expand credit? You can't unless you have the gold to back it. World War I shattered that illusion. Britain needed to finance armies, ships, and weapons. It couldn't wait for gold to arrive from South Africa, so it printed money anyway and suspended gold convertibility. Emergency measure, they said. It would be temporary. It wasn't. The war ended in 1918. But Britain, now broke, faced a choice: rejoin the gold standard at the old exchange rate, which would make British goods expensive and wreck exports, or devalue the pound. In 1925, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, chose pride over pragmatism. He rejoined at the old rate. What followed was a decade of stagnation. British exports couldn't compete. Unemployment soared. Gold flowed out of the Bank of England. Nobody in this story was stupid. Churchill understood the economic damage. But the gold standard was sacred, and abandoning it meant admitting defeat. So Britain strangled itself for the sake of a medal. Then came 1929, the crash, the depression. Nations that clung to gold were dragged down hardest. The U.S., still on gold, couldn't expand credit to rescue the economy, so it contracted, which made everything worse. Countries that abandoned gold first recovered first. Lesson learned, you'd think. But incentives matter more than lessons. After the Depression, after World War II, the surviving superpowers faced a new problem. The world needed a currency to trade with. Gold was impractical, there wasn't enough of it. So in 1944, at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the U.S. and its allies created a compromise. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations would peg their currencies to the dollar. It was gold standard light, a system that gave you the stability of gold without the economic strangulation. Except for one detail, it only worked if the U.S. kept its promise. For 20 years, it did. The U.S. had most of the world's gold. American exports dominated. The dollar was genuinely as good as gold. But then Vietnam happened. Then space programs. Then the Great Society. The U.S. spent money like it had infinite gold because at the time it acted like it did. By the late 1960s, the math no longer worked. American gold reserves were shrinking. Other nations watching this started cashing in their dollars for gold. It was a run on the bank, except the bank was the entire global financial system. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon did what he had to do. He closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer convertible to gold. The Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight. And here's the kicker: the world didn't end. What replaced it wasn't gold. It was something more abstract: trust in institutions, floating exchange rates, and the belief that currencies had value because nations said they did and the world agreed to accept them. It sounds fragile. In theory, it is. In practice, it's been more stable than gold ever was. The real story here isn't about gold, it's about constraints. The gold standard promised discipline but delivered paralysis. When an economy grows, it needs flexibility, the ability to expand credit, to respond to crisis, to invest in the future. Gold doesn't allow that, so nations abandoned it the moment they could afford to. This is why, even today, calls to return to the gold standard persist among certain economists and policymakers. They see inflation, they see government spending, and they think, if only we had the discipline of gold. They're looking at a straitjacket and calling it freedom. What they're really seeing is the cost of the system we actually have. The ability to print money without limit also means the ability to mismanage it without consequences. That's a real problem, but it's not a gold problem, it's a governance problem, and no amount of metal in a vault solves that. The gold standard didn't fail because gold was bad money. It failed because good money requires flexibility and gold is the opposite of flexible. Nations abandoned it not out of recklessness but out of necessity. The question isn't whether we should return to gold, it's how we manage the system we have. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe to see how today's hidden economic rules are shaping tomorrow's geopolitical winners. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.